Senator Cameron.
Thank you, Mr Deputy President. I rise in support of the bill before the Senate. Can I indicate that I have changed my mind on this issue? I have done what Senator Brandis has asked me to do, have a look at these issues dispassionately. I have certainly looked at it, and in my view, this is the best way forward in the short term. I just want to try and put my change of mind in some context. The UNHCR 2011 report on refugees shows that there were 4.3 million people newly displaced around the world. Worldwide, there is 42.5 million people either refugees or internally displaced, or almost 1 million in the process of actively seeking asylum. Afghanistan is the biggest producer of refugees with 2.7 million, and I have to say, surely we have a responsibility in terms of the situation in Afghanistan. Iraq, 1.4 million, Somalia, 1.1 million, Sudan, 500,000, and the Democratic Republic of the Congo, 491,000. The largest refugee hosting countries were Pakistan, 1.7 million, the Republic of Iran, 886,500, and the Syrian Arab Republic, 775,400. Now, the situation in those countries is dire, and you certainly would not want to be a refugee in those countries. In Australia, the number of refugees and asylum seekers has remained relatively stable and small by global standards. 23,434 refugees and 5,242 asylum seekers hosted at the end of 2011. And in Afghanistan and in Pakistan, we still see the Hazara population subject to genocide. I take the view that with 3.7 million refugees in the Asia-Pacific area, we need to deal with this both in the short and the long term. These refugees are looking for economic betterment, some of them. Some of them are looking for family reunification. Some of them are fleeing war. Some of them are fleeing conflict. Some of them are fleeing persecution, religious, racial, and sexual persecution. Some of them are fleeing natural disasters, climate change, and food insecurity. So this is not a situation that will change quickly. This is a situation that governments, regardless of their political background, will face in this region for years to come. I abhor the loss of life at sea. Children are losing their fathers and mothers. Parents are losing their children. Siblings are losing their brothers and sisters. These are human and personal tragedies of the highest order. I'm troubled by the Nauru approach. I'm troubled by the Malaysian approach. I have argued continually over many years my opposition to the Pacific solution. I have done that publicly. I have done it within the Labour Party, and I just don't see, regardless of the arguments that the coalition members have put up here, that Nauru could ever be contemplated as some kind of success. But a bit like Keynes said, and a bit like the Nobel Prize-winning economist Samuelson, when the circumstances change, you change your mind, and the question is asked, what would you do? Well, I have changed my mind. I met with 41 backbenchers yesterday, and it was clear those 41 backbenchers had no silver bullet to the problem that we are facing. But they all had one view, and that was we had to put some humanitarian approaches to what we were doing. What we are doing today is dealing with hard choices, not easy choices, because there are no easy solutions. The advice to the government has been that Nauru will not work, that it would not be a disincentive. And you have to remember that when Nauru was in place, on October the 19th, 2001, we had CivX, a ship going down and 353 people losing their life. This was under the Pacific solution. We are now being told that the boats would be turned around, and we are asked by the Leader of the Opposition to examine our conscience. As I've said, I've examined my conscience. I've done that, and my conscience says that we should do whatever we can to stop deaths at sea. There are two issues, I think, that are coming through the contributions here today. One is the hypocrisy of the coalition on the issue of humanity, and the other issue that's coming through loud and clear is the policy purity of the Greens. Well, Gough Whitlam said only the impotent are pure. And I think the Greens are standing flat-footed, but pure. You're pure, but flat-footed. I think you have to think about the brothers, the sisters, the mothers, the fathers, and the friends who are dying on the oceans to the north of Australia. These are human beings. They are not statistics. They are not simply refugees. They are not simply asylum seekers. These are human beings, for one reason or another, who want to make a better life for themselves within this great country. The opposition hypocrisy is huge. Many of the speakers who are listed to speak here today and who have already spoke were silent on the cruelty of the Pacific solution. Absolutely silent. Where was Senator Abetz and Senator Brandis when genuine refugees were sewing their lips together in desperation? When kids of 12-year-old, 14-year-old and 15-year-old were sewing their lips together as a desperate cry for help under the Pacific solution? Where were the voices of humanitarian support in the coalition? They were nowhere to be heard. Where was the action from the coalition on humanitarian issues? Nowhere to be seen. So the hypocrisy is huge from the coalition. Where was the member from North Sydney, Joe Hockey, during the child overboard fiasco? Where were the coalition voices on that? Nowhere to be heard. Where was the Leader of the Opposition when refugees were being vilified and ostracised in the Australian press, day in, day out? Nowhere to be seen, because base politics were driving the Pacific solution. Base politics were driving the coalition's position on refugees. So I just find it a bit tough, a bit hard to take when the coalition stand up here and talk about humanitarian approaches to refugees, for when almost a decade their approach was the antithesis of humanitarian approaches for refugees. And I do say that to Senator Abetz, when he stood up and said that there was a great compassionate position adopted by Mr. Ruddock, the then minister. In 2001, Mr. Ruddock was calling for children to be removed from their parents in these concentration camps that they had set up at Baxter and elsewhere in Australia. Take the children from the parents. That was the refrain from the coalition. What is humane about that? Absolutely nothing. And then there was a young boy in Villawood. When Mr. Ruddock was asked about that young boy and his plight in Villawood, Mr. Ruddock could not bring himself to describe this child as a boy or a human being. He described the child as it. As it. That was the humanitarian approach from the coalition. So I will not be lectured by the coalition in terms of humanitarian policies or successful policies. What is successful about describing a young child as it? What is successful about taking children from parents? What is successful about putting families behind barbed wire for year after year after year until they are psychologically destroyed? So the hypocrisy from the coalition knows no bounds, and the impotence from the Greens is almost rivaling that. I say you should not have been silent on the cruelty of the Pacific solution. I want to come to this Malaysian arrangement. As I've said, I don't like it. I have probably fought longer on these issues than many in this Parliament. It's been an issue that I, as a union official, as a union delegate, and a senior union official in this country have argued against for years. But I just do not want to see any more innocent people being killed on the high seas. I don't want people losing their mother, their father, their brother, their sister, their children. It is just not acceptable. And the 41 backbenchers yesterday were crying out for a compromise on this issue. We were crying out for something to be done. This is not a perfect proposition that is before the Parliament. In fact, it is far from perfect. But I think for a 12-month period, as is outlined in this bill, we should give it a go. Because the Malaysian approach is an approach that the UNHCR have had a look at, that the UNHCR were involved in, that the UNHCR see as a step forward to what the real solution in this region is, and that is a proper regional approach to dealing with refugees and displaced persons. That's the situation that the UNHCR see. They argue, and others argue, that Malaysia do a lot of heavy lifting in terms of refugees. They do far more heavy lifting than us. There's about 1.2 million people, I think, in Malaysia displaced. But what the UNHCR say is that the implementation of the Malaysian guidelines, that they contain important protection safeguards. They include respect for the principle of non-refoulement, and non-refoulement is simply not sending people back to where they could be tried and killed or subject to the death penalty. They say the principle of family unity and the best interests of the child are in this agreement. that humane reception conditions, including protection against arbitrary detention, are there, that the lawful status to remain in Malaysia until a durable solution is found is there, and the ability to receive education, access to health care, and a right to employment is there. There will be no employment on Nauru. No employment. They'll be there with all that barren rock provides. I mean, what is it about Nauru that is better than that? Absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. So the UNHCR sees some hope that this could lead to a more lasting solution. And I just want to quote, to go back to the coalition and their hypocrisy, what the Secretary-General of Amnesty International, Irene Khan, said in 2002. She said this about the coalition policy that they are arguing is so successful. She said it is obvious that the prolonged periods of detention, characterised by frustration and insecurity, are doing further damage to individuals who have fled grave human rights abuses. The detention policy has failed as a deterrent and succeeded only as a punishment. How much longer will children and their families be punished for seeking safety from persecution? That was the Pacific solution. That's what the coalition are arguing we should adopt again. Well, I will not support that, and the government will not support this. It is not what we should be doing. We should be looking at a longer-term proposition. And there are two areas that we should be looking at. One is the UNHCR's plan of action on refugee protection and mixed migration. There's a 10-point plan that can guide countries in relation to refugees. And the other is the core principles adopted by the 4th Bali Regional Ministerial Conference in Indonesia. And what the UNHCR's plan of action boiled down is this. It says that the people who need protection receive it, that those who do not are assisted to return home, and that all people are treated with dignity while appropriate solutions are found. That is something that the Pacific solution never, ever contemplated. The 4th Bali Regional Council has said that irregular movements facilitated by people smugglers should be eliminated. That's what this bill is seeking to do. It said asylum seekers should have access to consistent assessment processes. That's what this bill is seeking to do. It says persons found to be refugees under those assessments should be provided with a durable solution. This is the first step to a durable solution for refugees and asylum seekers. Persons found not to be in need of protection should be returned. People smuggling enterprises should be targeted through border security arrangements, law enforcement activities, and disincentives to human trafficking and smuggling. Mr. Deputy President, my view is, and my view has changed, that this is the best approach we can adopt. It is a compromise position that I think the Australian public are crying out for. It's a position that is a short-term position to allow some of the longer-term Bali process and UNHCR processes to be put in place. Something that I would be far more comfortable about. But as a union official, I had to accept many short-term decisions and accommodations for my membership so that they could get better conditions in the longer term. This is a similar situation. Negotiators find themselves in this position constantly, and we should not go back to a position where we try and turn boats around and put our navy and put asylum seekers in jeopardy. We should not go back to the Pacific solution where young kids are sewing their lips up and hypocrisy abounds in the coalition. And I call on the Greens to reconsider their position and don't be impotent, and actually make a contribution to this solution and help refugees.
Order, Senator Cameron, your time has expired.